Nope, you got Michelle tonight.
Okay, sorry, Michelle.
That's okay.
Okay, let me pull up. I had the agenda here and then it disappeared. Okay, so this is the City of Gig Harbor Design Review Board virtual meeting of April 22nd, 2021. It's 5 p.m. We have 2 applications tonight. This is an open public meeting. So if there are any appearance of fairness issues, I guess let's do roll call first and then we'll go into that. I'll start. Brett Marlowe DeSantis.
Tommy Kent Smith.
Aaron Filan.
John Ashlock.
Marlene Drucker.
Nels is joining.
Nels Peterson.
Hey, Brett, just a clarification too. Now we're
Yeah.
going roll call. We get staff on there, but I think we have a deletion on one of the applicants, right? We just have one tonight.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't aware of that. Okay, city staff.
Carl DeSemus, staff.
Michelle Thomas, planning technician.
Okay, we're all good.
Good.
And I would confirm that we did lose an application this evening that's been rescheduled, and I can't think of what date that it's been rescheduled to, but maybe at the end Michelle can go over the upcoming schedule.
Okay, that sounds great. Well,
May 13th.
I'm sorry.
I thought the email said May 13th.
Yeah.
Okay,
That is correct.
so when we're talking about appearance of fairness issues, we're discussing the West Harbor Corporate Park. Is that correct?
No,
That was the one that was rescheduled?
No, tonight we will be, the applicant for this evening is West Harbor Corporate Park. And so we're looking at the
Okay.
Mallard's Landing Lot 7 proposal. this
Okay.
evening.
That's it.
Excellent. So in terms of that application, does anyone on the board need to recuse themselves for any reason?
No.
No.
Nope.
Okay, I don't know if we have any public members, so is there anyone else on the line that would see any of our board members as not being able to be present on this project? Okay, let's go ahead and hand it over for the staff report, please.
Oh, thank you, Chair. This is Carl DeSemus, Senior Planner here with the City of Gig Harbor. It's nice to see everybody. It's been a while since I've met with the Design Review Board. So nice to see everybody, even though it's in this virtual environment. So tonight we are looking at a couple of design alternatives that have been proposed by the applicant, West Harbor Corporate Park, and through their architect and agent, Wattenberger Architects. And from the applicant team, we have with us tonight 3 representatives, Thayer Jorgensen, Chris DeWald, and then James Brown from Wattenberger Architects. This project has come before you one time before. Actually, there was a pre-app that was done with the DRB previously, and then there was an official meeting that was done back on January 23rd of 2020, where 2 alternatives were reviewed. But really quickly, and just to refresh everyone, the proposal is a senior living facility that's going to be located at Mallard's Landing Lot 7, which is at the intersection of 72nd Street and Wagner Way. Sorry, a little feedback there. The project would consist of approximately 83 units with a mix of independent living, assisted living, and memory care units. The building will be 3 stories and would be approximately 94,000 square feet. The site where it will be located is approximately 4.5 acres. And I wanted to show you here. Can everybody see my screen okay there?
Yes.
Yes.
So the site is located here, adjacent to the legacy plat, what was known as the 72nd Street plat, and across the street from what's known as the Dogwood plat. This is the site here, and it kind of the lot lines are for some reason not showing up for me here. I don't know why, but there they are. Thank you, whoever did that. This is the lot line. So previously there was a binding site plan that was approved for this site that approved it for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parcels and then common area. It has frontage on both 72nd Street and Wagner Way to the south. As part of this proposal, the overall proposal, they're revising the binding site plan to eliminate these other parcels, bring it back to one contiguous parcel, and place the large 94,000 square foot building sort of on the kind of northerly northwestern portion of the site. It would access from both 72nd Street as well as from Wagner Way. You can see here that there's some vegetation on the site, in particular, and of note for this evening, there is vegetation on the western boundary, which is a zone transition buffer that is shared with the legacy plat through a concomitant agreement. And in so doing, the zone transition buffer is split between legacy plat and Mallard's Landing 7, with 20 feet existing on the Mallard 7 side and 20 feet existing on the legacy side. In addition to that, because plats require a 25-foot landscape area, 5 feet of the landscape area for legacy plat is actually contained within that 40-foot zone transition buffer. 5 feet of that is actually on the Mallard's Landing 7 side. And then just briefly for zoning, we have RB2 zone for Mallard's 7. Dogwood plat is split between, is this RB1 and R1, and legacy plat is entirely R1 zoning. The zone transition buffer applies in this case because of the RB1 adjacent to the R1 zone. Stop sharing that. And so, as I said previously, the applicant brought before you a couple of design alternatives proposed under 1799-380 mass and scale and 1799-240 natural site conditions. The latter of those two is also germane to this evening's conversation, as the applicant is proposing to extend the wall that was previously recommended for approval at that previous design review board meeting. Tonight, the applicant is requesting the DRB review 2 items. Zone transition buffer standards, and that would be 1799-180, and also the criteria design elements contained in 1799-200, the alternative zone transition standards. Also asking that you review 1799-240 natural site conditions, as I stated previously. So public notice was provided for this meeting this evening, and we did receive 1 comment from the neighbors to the west. And Chair, would you like me to read that comment into the record? I believe it was provided to everyone here.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. So this letter is dated April 21st, 2021, regarding the Mallard's Landing Lot 7 development, to whom it may concern. We are writing this letter to express ongoing concerns about the proposed development of an assisted living facility at Lot 7 of Mallard's Landing. We are homeowners in the Rush-developed legacy community immediately west of the proposed building site. First, we are disappointed to learn of the significant tree removal planned within the buffer zone immediately past the legacy homeowners' eastern fence lines. Nearly all of the large 50+ feet heritage trees are slated for removal. As we understand, the proposed development may challenge the drip lines and/or critical root zones, which would affect the health and safety of the trees. We believe it is prudent to consider the short and long-term environmental impact of removal of these trees and to consider modifications to the proposed development in order to preserve the trees of this ecosystem. The function of these trees cannot be replaced through new planting. They are home to wildlife and preserve the natural habitat of this area of Gig Harbor. They also provide a natural screen for sightline, sound, and light pollution. They will provide immediate privacy for the future residents of the assisted living facility and current legacy homeowners. Of particular interest to us is an approximately 50-foot healthy tree within the 20-foot buffer at the corner of our lot that is planned for removal. We have observed biodiversity within this singular tree, including nesting birds, small mammals, and even activity of bald eagles. Per proposed documents from the Design Review Board meeting on 1/23/20 and on 4/15/21, it appears that parking spaces may be the cause of removal for this decades-old tree. We would especially appreciate if this tree may be retained given its impact on the ecosystem and privacy of residents. Similarly, we question if the proposed construction would negatively impact the drip lines and critical root zones of large trees already planted on our and other homeowners of Legacy's property. In some cases, our trees are within inches of these heritage trees slated to be removed. We have attended all public meetings regarding this project since 2020 and have been frustrated by the lack of opportunity for members of the immediate community to voice concern. In particular, the previous DRB meeting focused more on aesthetics of the building than the actual functional impact the development may have. We would appreciate if further discussion may allow for more participation from the community. Finally, although we welcome the expansion of our community, we hope that development may proceed in a way that has the best interest for the environment, as well as both the legacy homeowner community and future residents of the assisted living facility. Sincerely, Jessica Carlisle and Nicholas Mazzarni, and they provided their email addresses.
Thank you, Carl. Is that the end of the staff presentation for now?
Briefly, I would just like to talk about the two alternatives that have been proposed.
Okay.
If I may, Chair. Under the staff analysis, I've provided a review of the alternatives and what the applicant has proposed. The applicant's narrative is detailed and does a great job of explaining what the applicant is trying to achieve, but I won't go into that. What I will say then, as far as zone transition buffering standards, and something that should be noted for the discussion this evening, is that while we are talking about zone transition buffering standards, the applicant has chosen to develop within the zone transition buffer, and in so doing, they are then required to meet the alternative zone transition standards of 1799-200. And so I just wanted to alleviate any confusion in my staff report in that I've included 1799-180 because we are talking about zone transition buffering standards, but the recommendation that the DRB is asked to consider this evening is relative to 1799-200, and those are the alternative zone transition standards. And that's how the code, the design manual is set up. So each of the zone transition standards have to be taken individually and considered by the design review board in order to recommend approval of a design alternative under 1799-200. Hopefully that's clear, Chair, but I can, and when we start getting into it, I can certainly explain more. So to kind of clear it up.
So Carl, can I ask a question? Because talk to me about the the agreement between the two subject parcels requiring the zone transition buffer. If there's an agreement already for 20 feet on either side, if they can meet that 20 feet of dense vegetative buffer to meet the standards, do they not meet it outright?
That would be correct if they could develop the buffer. So you're right. The 20 feet is a modification to what would be required otherwise of the 40 feet, and that modification was allowed through the concomitant agreement. However, the applicant is proposing development within their 20 feet of the buffer, and in order to approve development within the zone transition buffer, they have to meet the standards, the zone transition standards of 1799-200. In particular, they're proposing removal of significant vegetation, proposing grading, and proposing retaining wall.
So looking at their site plan, I guess I'm still a little bit confused on that. The actual development, ultimate, I mean, let's say the buffer didn't have any vegetation in it currently. Is planting new vegetation within the required buffer area, does that constitute development?
No, but
the only thing I'm really seeing is a bit of, I mean, the final development, ultimately, even the retaining wall is outside that 20 foot, right?
The retaining wall, I believe, is within the 20 feet, or no, that's within the, let me zoom in on this.
I'm looking at
Within the 10 feet. I'm
yeah.
sorry, that's correct. There's a 20-foot buffer. The wall is actually within the 10 feet, which is the no construction zone regulated under 1778.
Okay. All right, just wanted to make sure that we have a baseline for going into all 13 criteria of the alternative zones and transition. So,
and let me, and that was probably a mistake and oversight in my staff report too, but I'm going to share. So this is the grading plan for the project here. So this is the required 20 feet.
Right.
You can see that there's grading within that zone transition buffer.
Okay.
I believe just in that area. So they were able to push everything out using the wall to the south. But in this area up here, they propose grading in the zone transition buffer. And I'd have to pull up the landscape plan.
Hey, Carl, how many feet is that? How wide is that they're inside the buffer?
With the grading?
Yeah.
Looks like almost 10.
Yeah, 10 feet probably.
At one point.
Yeah, 10 to 15 feet at its widest point here.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I would ask the question, even though, I mean, ultimately they are going to create the required buffer. And, I guess it looks to be some topographic, disturbance, in a little bit of an area there to kind of clean things up. I don't know if I'm looking at the final grade or existing grade, but I guess I look at this as saying, well, the applicant then is not only providing the prescriptive approach to it, but then if they, are also looking at the alternative zone transition standards with everything associated with the building, the complete 13 items, then I would think they're, more than meeting the criteria if we find it to be so, because I think ultimately the buffer will be established.
Yeah, Darren, I agree.
Typically in these things, it's where we can't have the buffer. right? That's why we use the alternative zone transition standards, because we can't maintain that, or they don't have the ability to do it. You know, and in this case, I think it looks a little more, you know, amplified, you know, as far as a problem, because, you know, on the R1 zone, although they have a 20-foot buffer, it hasn't been created. It looks to not have been created at all. And, you know, although you know, I'm very empathetic, you know, to the letter that was sent in, you know, relative to losing trees in your backyard. It's very personal. I get that. But if you look at the satellite imagery of that property where the legacy homes were developed in 2015, it had far more significant trees than what we're talking about here. And they were all taken out right up to the, you know, the property line, not showing, in essence, you know, any sort of acknowledgement for creating the 20-foot buffer that would be needed on that R1 side. So I think, although I'm, you know, I don't want to sound cynical, but it's, you know, I feel like the applicant is really presenting a good alternative here. And for the most part, I really think that they're almost meeting it prescriptively. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, and something that I, you know, had several meetings with the applicant on in trying to navigate this code section. And I think there has been in the past, it has been applied differently in using alternative landscape plans to sort of navigate through this zone transition buffer and where development might occur within it. But upon looking at the code again and going through an iterative interpretation process, we found that it appears to us, to staff, that the zone transition buffer is not meant to be developed within at all, whether they're removing significant vegetation or not. And so, again, maintaining all significant vegetation then within that zone transition buffer is what we believe the intent of the design manual and Chapter 1778 combined is trying to achieve. And you're right, I believe that once the zone transition buffer is applied, and once they've met the definition of the zone transition buffer and they have it vegetated, likely it'll be a strong buffer, and you know, and in some cases maybe we end up with a better product after that development has occurred within that buffer. I don't, you know, that's not for me to say, but when we're interpreting the code and looking at it, and they are proposing development within that 20 feet that they're required to have for vegetative dense vegetative buffer, we're kind of left in a tough spot.
Okay. Well, I'll just, you know, in one sense, you know, we'll let you set the course for, you know, what we're reviewing. You know, I'm not gonna, you know, challenge it, you know, too harshly, but again, I would just serve up my thoughts to the other DRB members in regards when you're looking at the project.
Hey, Carl, this is Nels. I kind of follow up with what Darren is saying. Am I misunderstanding that there's a equal 20-foot buffer going to the west into that neighborhood?
That's correct.
But were they under the same guise to not disturb native vegetation? Because I can't figure out from the satellite where that is, because it looks like it's all backyards.
Yeah, so they should have been. And let me stop sharing this and go back to the aerial since we're talking about that. One sec here. We'll pull off this. And Board Member Peterson, I believe you're right. It's a good observation, and an observation that staff has made as well, that it appears that the zone transition buffer standards were not applied properly in that case. on the legacy side. And there were required plantings that were to go into the rear 20 feet. So that plat, when we're subdividing, there are two options for the developer. They can either place the perimeter buffer on planting areas within a tract, or they can put it into an easement on the properties themselves. In this case, they chose to use the easement route. And so there is, and you can kind of see it if you follow this down, although you lost there and maybe there, but there is supposed to be and is a 20-foot easement that was recorded with this subdivision. And that within that 20-foot easement is supposed to be a zone transition planted to the standards of a zone transition buffer.
Okay. I mean, that it's not relevant, but it kind of like Darren, it's comical that I mean, it was absolutely nuked right up to every last little stem was taken out. And here we're nitpicking over a little area where we're removing some diseased trees, where we're getting some grading done, and then we're getting it established back to meeting prescriptively. So yeah, I agree with Darren. It's something to think as we keep seeing the presentation here.
Well, we also, another point, this maybe goes back to when member Gagliano was on the board. I thought and I don't recall, you'd have to remind me, Carl, if we initiated some new sort of policy about sort of finding sort of average, clustering, for some of these zone transitions. Remember, we talked about issues where we'd have a linear transition, a certain width, but maybe we would have some more significant vegetation, in a particular area, that we could reduce it in some areas if we could, create and maintain larger pockets of clustered trees, within the zone transition would be more of a natural configuration. I don't remember if that ultimately became policy, but it almost seems like in this case, there's a couple of different instances along the west property line where, the buffering and the vegetation could even be wider, than that. So again, I'm thinking it's like so close in regards to, what I would constitute any kind of major development that it doesn't seem to fit the requirements to move into the full-on blown alternative zone transition standards. Not to say that the building, we can listen to it and talk about them individually as the board, but and I think the building has done a great job probably meeting many of those things, but it just seems like it's borderline that it, really wouldn't need to go there.
Well, my personal belief in looking at the plans and what is being graded and replanting, they're actually going to come back with a better situation when they're finished than exists at the present time.
Well, we could, rather than debate, what the problem is today, I guess we could just start talking about the issues and get on with it, I guess.
Did everyone get a chance to question Carl, and shall we move to the applicant? Okay, I'm going to say yes to that. Applicant introductions, please. You're up.
Thanks for having us. I'm James Brown with Wattenberger Architects, the lead architect on the project. We've also got Thayer Jorgensen, the civil engineer, Chris DeWald, representing Rush Companies, and we have Michelle, the landscape architect. In case any specific questions come up related to technical questions related to the grading or tree mitigation and planting, they might be able to step in and answer them a little bit better than I could. I don't know how much we want to kind of rehash because the board has seen this project before. I don't know how much we want to really rehash the background of the project, or if we want to speak specifically to what we're proposing and asking for consideration from the board for.
Hey, James, I have one question for you. The letter that came from the public was saying significant tree removal, but your presentation is showing 96% retainage, which is correct. I mean, it looks like yours is, but I want to give the the lady who emailed us or mailed in her day.
Well, we certainly have made every effort to retain all of the vegetation in that buffer. As you know, there's a significant cross slope on this site. So one thing that has changed since the board last saw the project is that Carl pointed out, I think he had missed it, we had missed it. There was a requirement for an additional 10-foot no construction zone adjacent to the buffer. And I believe that's applicable anytime. Certainly, the intent of that appears to be to help protect the integrity of the buffer. So what we have actually done is we have shifted the entire parking lot and drive aisle off of the property line along the west by an additional 10 feet. That did two things. It gave us another 8 feet of planting because we do have 2 feet of wall thickness in that 10-foot additional space in the buffer. But it gave us an additional 8 feet of planting, and it allowed us to really pull back our grading from the property line. So the end result is that I think we have significantly more tree retention. We've got more room to plant with for the tree mitigation and for the buffer enhancements. And we're able to keep the grade higher, which is kind of a net benefit for the property owners, because that's, you know, the higher we can keep that grade, the more that's going to help raise the level of planting and help screen our project from their view. So I feel like we made real significant progress here, and in our opinion, I think what's going to result out of this, I think, is going to be superior to what's existing or what would otherwise be there if we just manage to prescriptively somehow completely avoid it. I think that the mitigation we're providing is going to result in something better in the end.
Thank you for that clarification.
Carl, I don't know if there is a way to share my screen, or if you could maybe pull up the architectural site plan, maybe.
Michelle, could you give Mr. Brown the ability to share his screen, please?
I believe all panelists do.
James, there should be a share screen button in green if
Okay.
you at the bottom.
Yeah,
of
I see it.
Okay, it hides itself when you're.
Okay. So I wanted to really quickly go through kind of the two items that we're specifically asking for consideration on. The first one is, we really made every effort, but at the end of the day, we do have this limited area that we have to do some grading in to make this all work. So what we are really requesting the design review board's approval and acceptance of is our encroachment for the purposes of doing some grading, and that depth that it goes into the 20-foot buffer on our side of the property line is 11 feet at its maximum point. There really just was not a way with all the cross slope that we're having to deal with to get that out of there. And our hope is that the board, in reviewing the criteria that we need to meet to for the board to support our request for relief here, our hope is that the board will recognize that we're meeting those criteria and that we are going to end up with an improved condition at the end. The second issue that we're requesting consideration from the board on relates to the retaining wall exceeding the 6-foot height limitation in the code. I'm sure that the board remembers the discussions that we had on our last round. We have a large, a fire access lane that we need to get behind the building for life safety. It was very important to the fire department to make sure that we had that access. And as the site just tightens up there, the result was there was no way to provide that without exceeding that 6-foot retaining wall height. Well, what our efforts to kind of improve this buffer have kind of resulted in is that we've pushed this whole parking lot and drive aisle 10 feet further into our property. And it's put additional pressure on the opposite side of the drive aisle so that that wall is now pushing above the 6 feet. Previously, the section of wall that exceeded 6 feet kind of died up against as it was making the curve toward the drive aisle. And now, because the road is closer to the detention vault and we have to keep maintenance access and clear around that vault, it's just put too much pressure on the grading. And so we've got a wall here that is, let's see, I think at its maximum, it is approximately 10 feet, which is a little bit less than what we have at our maximum point from the previous request. So that's a quick summary of what we're asking the board to consider. I don't know if Carl, if you want to speak in the context of your staff reports to the individual items for that are required for consideration for the our request related to the buffer, or if you would like me to. We did submit a narrative in detail on that, and I know that Carl and his report has put his input in.
James, could I clarify really quickly on the wall section that's greater than 6 feet, the new section? I think in your analysis, it was about 8.5 feet at its high point. Just don't want it to be overstated if that's the case, just so the DRB has. Well, yeah, it does look like it's taller than that there, though. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like there. I may have been an error there. It looks like 10 feet is the maximum right here.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted that. Yeah, the clarification. And then to your question, I have to leave that up to the chair and how they would like to proceed through the analysis.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, James. I would like to pose a question to our board on how they would like to proceed. I was not here for the initial meeting, I believe, when they first came to us. I'm wondering, and Carl, you might shut this down, whether we are able to request relief from the zone transition buffer standards for them because they are accomplishing it, or whether you are definitive in us going through the criteria for the alternative.
Thank you, Chair. And I really, I love these discussions, and I appreciate the Design Review Board's thoughts on on this in particular. And it seems like I'm always bringing these landscaping conundrums to the board that we get kind of tossed around on. But in our estimation and in our interpretation, any development within the zone transition buffer would require some sort of alternative. And in this case, if they're not able to develop outside of the zone transition buffer, then we believe those alternative zone transition buffer standards must be applied.
Okay, so yeah, let's go through them then.
Chair, if I could, one additional item. We had a, sorry, I'm just bringing up my email here really quick. We may have some folks who were able to get into the meeting. They were having some trouble getting into the meeting earlier. There was a link that was sent out that was expired. And it appears that there may be some folks who are wanting to make public comment.
Are you now allowing public comment during these virtual meetings?
I have not been I've not been coming to the DRB, so I
Okay,
apologize.
so
Michelle?
Carl, for the past year, they put a deadline on public comment that it had to be in and it could be read into the minutes, but they have not allowed the public to comment at the meeting.
Okay.
Katrina asked me to allow it for tonight.
Okay, that's it then. Then you're allowed. Do you want to, is it time to open it up now or do you want to do that later?
I would say that I would say doing it now would probably be the right way to go after the presentations and then get into the analysis and deliberation.
Okay, please do so. Are they with us? Is everyone in?
Michelle?
If anybody wants to make a public comment, they just need to hit *9 on their phone, and that will let us know they're raising their hand to make comment. And we have two. So, Nicholas.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And first off, thank you to Rush for, adding in that extra 10. I appreciate you guys making that effort. And also, it's nice to see the extra vegetation there that's being planted. However, my concern is, well, first off, it's been very confusing, and we've been told multiple things throughout the past, I don't know, year or so as to what exactly is being removed and what isn't. My first question is, with that added buffer, that's 30 feet now, right? In between sort of the fence line and then the construction. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what exactly is being removed and what isn't? Because the last time seeing a map of what was being removed, and then someone from Rush was nice enough to do a walkthrough with us, it seemed like almost everything was, including some of the trees that I think in that letter that someone wrote in are very tall. So while I appreciate the trees being planted, I think they're 6, 7, 8, 9 feet, which is a pretty big difference between what's there now. And I also want to say, while I appreciate the logic of, well, we did it before when we built a home, so what's the big deal now? I don't think I necessarily agree with that. Just because it was done before means let's do it again or keep doing it. Thanks again for your time, everybody.
Thank you, Nicholas. Do we have another one?
We have one from Lynn Anderson. And Lynn, if you could unmute yourself, I've given you permission to talk.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. I have to say, I was the first homeowner in Legacy to actually occupy a home here, and I'm on lot 2, which is one of the most impacted lots by this development. And I am horrified at today's proceedings, quite frankly. I have written in before about this. We have been stripped of our protection, both visually and from an audio perspective, from the noises of Highway 16 with the surrounding Rush developments in here. And this is like the last stand. And I have the backyard that has the terracing, and I have reforested my backyard because I was left with one measly maple tree by Rush. Nothing was to code for the city of Gig Harbor in my backyard. I just had a steeply graded property that bark was thrown onto. I am a little bit concerned that you are taking away the enjoyment of my backyard. And I would just plead with you to ensure that we have a buffer of trees that will keep us safe from the constant emergency traffic that's going to go on that new street in and out of Mallard's Lot number 7. People surrounding me are selling their houses left and right to get out of here. They just don't want to be part of this. And I think the city needs to be protecting all of its citizens and all of its constituents. And I see you shaking your head, Marlene, and you know what? You need to be objective and listen and process to what I am saying.
I apologize. I was actually communicating to somebody in my house.
Thank you, Lynn. Okay, Michelle, is there anyone else who would like to speak?
I do not have anybody else.
Okay, Carl, shall I give it back to you?
Certainly, Chair. So my recommendation, if I could, would be to take each one of these design elements one by one, and look at the staff's analysis as well as the applicant's analysis, and I suppose you could also allow the applicant to present on each one of the design elements, or make their case if that were acceptable or desirable to the design review board, if it would help in the decision.
I think that would be great. Is the applicant ready to do that?
Sure. Yeah, I can go through the narrative that we put together to touch on each of these points. And then I know Carl also has his own summary, if maybe after I kind of go through our narrative, if he wants to maybe chime in and add any context from the planning department's perspective.
Okay, thank you, James.
Jump in just for a second. Again, in the sake of, sort of time, we did discuss alternative zone transitions for this project, every one of these items. And I don't know if that was during the pre-app, prior to, but it seemed like we had gone through every single one of these. We talked about the windows, the fenestrations, the roof lines, where the services are located, each one of these. Now, Brett, you might not have been a part of that, but
Yeah, I wasn't here.
No.
So thank you for communicating that.
I agree that we went through the majority of these when we had our previous meeting, because I remember specifically the fact that the fire safety takes precedent over the city code.
Then what I would say, Darren, is do we have a quorum from that prior meeting that can speak to that?
well,
And I remember it.
you were okay, John. Nels, were you a part of that?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Marlene?
Yes, I was at that meeting.
Okay, so I think majority of the DRB members, I guess all of them with the exception of you, Brett, I've already discussed this a bit. So I would ask of the applicant, have you made any significant design changes to the building since our last discussion on this? I know we've talked about the movement, the repositioning of your drive lane and parking, and the impact on the retaining wall. In essence, what's happening at the zone buffer. But what about the building specifically?
There's been no change to the building itself. The only change really is the shift in the drive aisle and parking to get it further away from the property and add some additional space to that buffer.
Okay. Can we see a site plan up here? Okay, so so the changes that we're looking at, really, you've increased the vegetative area by an additional 10 feet.
Yes.
By sliding that all back. Okay.
I can share, I have, this is the original grading plan. And as you can see, it was all the way up to the property line. It had a much larger impact. And previously, yes, there were a lot of trees that we were proposing to take out. Under the current plan, that's been pulled back pretty significantly. The landscape plan kind of illustrates the limits of the trees within that buffer that are impacted. And we're just down to a handful that we just could not find a way to work around. And it's really primarily a small cluster right in here opposite the main entrance to the building.
Okay.
You can see the tree protection line that kind of mirrors the line on the architectural site plan that is kind of isolating off the area where we have to do some limited grading. And of course, that impacts this small cluster of trees.
James, are you guys filling the property at that point?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you filling the property at that point with grade? You're going to change the grade by filling it?
No, this is a cut condition, but what we are able to do in the new proposal is we're reducing the amount of grading. So it's keeping the grade higher adjacent to the property line. And what that's doing is helping to preserve more of the landscaping and keep the landscaping higher so that it's blocking more of a visual block to the adjacent single family homes.
Well, I know you're going to cut it where the retaining wall is down to the parking, but at the top of the retaining wall and then back towards the boundary line, is it still the blue lines in your topo? That's new grading?
Yes, and this is all a cut condition here.
Got it. What is it doing now then? So is there a mound there?
If you can bear with me, I can pull up the survey. So currently there is kind of a high point, or I suppose you could call it a mound, in the corner of the site, the northwest corner. So the cut, it starts over near where we've got our site access driveway. And so part of that cut that you were seeing is in response to getting a level access to the site over there. And then as it wraps around and kind of moves into the parking area, the cut is really along, I think it might be about 120 feet of this area here where this little mole or bump in the existing topo exists.
Okay. And can you, for the sake of public comment, and their concerns, can you just review the tree retention? Again, Nels, I think had mentioned, or John did, the percentages of trees retained.
Sure. Let me get to that. If there is any way, Michelle, for you to chime in, you might be able to point me a little bit quicker to the retention percentage.
Now there's a percentage of overall site. Oh, my got feedback, sorry. It's overall site percentage, not specifically just the buffer. There are, in that area where you pointed out the cluster, are actually 3 viable trees that are being removed. The others are already dead, dying or diseased trees. So they're in decline and will die. And the sizes of the trees that are actually being removed are quite small. They're, as you see, a 7-inch, 18, and a 17, or I guess 4 trees, and then an 8-inch maple. So the larger trees are being retained.
Okay.
Does that help?
Well, I think it helps just clarify, probably for our neighboring properties concerns, at least to, give them sort of some clear understanding of what's being retained and what is not.
But yeah, there is an overall 89% significant tree retention, but that's site-wide, as Michelle said.
Although most of the trees are on that side.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah.
Okay. Well, and again, and I heard, and this is maybe to some of the other DRB members, I mean, I heard obviously, the emotion that is associated with, development, right adjacent to your property, within the comments. And again, empathetic to that. What we can't really speak to right now is why there is not a 20-foot dense vegetative buffer on the R1 property. It's just unfortunate, because if it were there, we, would have half of the, the problem already sort of working in our favor, or at least in the applicant's favor. And so I think it exacerbates, the impact of what's happening, but it's sort of outside the purview of this. It's unfortunate that it exists that way, but it takes time, I think, to get these, once trees been cut down, it takes time to get them, reestablished. So, in my opinion, Brett, I think we could probably just, go through these alternative zone transition standards. If we must, I think we've come to the conclusion that Carl thinks the city's position is we need to, look at applying this standard. And then I guess the one other would be, reviewing again the retaining wall that's, on the east side of the drive lane next to the storm retention vault. It seems like, in my opinion, that if we apply the same standard or our sort of reasoning, originally to that we would come to the same conclusion that if you can provide vegetation on the downhill slope of that in order to mitigate, the visual impact of the wall, and it seems like it's not nearly as high as the original one that we looked at. It's a little bit further north along that wall, that we can come to a reasonable, finding there as well. So with that said, Brett, I think we could just go through, I think if you want to lead the charge, I think we would look at starting with that zone transition. Where am I at here?
Darren, I actually think, since you're more familiar with the project than I am and you're my co-pilot, that I will hand this one over to you if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, I am. So, all right. So let's, if you're looking at the staff report, I'm spinning through, I think I'm on about page 6 of 10. That gets us to 1799-200, the alternative zone transition standards. And we would start with the separation of structures. Okay. And there are 13 of these. So I think we can, start moving through these things pretty well. Okay. Let's make sure we got lighting. Yes. Okay. All right. So the first one is in regards to, the proximity of the building, which has a large footprint. Obviously, it's completely different in scale, than the R1, but very similar to some of the other development that is easterly of the property. Its distance, as Carl has pointed out here, is about 83 feet from the western property line. Okay, so I think in total, looking at the distance of the R1 properties or the structures in the R1, we're at about 113 feet. from the proposed structure. Plus, in essence, we're supposed to have a combined 40-foot buffer between there. In my opinion, I think the building has got a significant separation to the adjacent structures. Other comments from the DRB members?
Agree.
I also agree.
Okay. Can we have like a site plan up too while we're going through this maybe? I guess we might ask for to flip through maybe on the architectural exhibit, the arc drawings. I think within your 21 sheets there, we probably can flip back and forth between ones that are relevant to the subject matter. Yeah. So just a quick site plan, just to recap on separation of structures so we can see that distance there visually. I would say if we go to, let's see here.
Is there a specific plan you'd like to see?
I think, well, we can't quite see, let me see if we have it on the, I don't think there's anything within your drawing. Maybe Carl, you could show your satellite image one more time, just so we have the reference to the existing R1s, so we can see them, and then we'll flip to maybe sheet A03, which shows the site plan. So, all right. So you can get a sense, members, you can get a sense of, where all the lots have been built up, and you're probably looking at, somewhere between, what did we say, 30+ feet or so from the back property line, up to the structures. Okay, so that keep that, sort of take a mental picture in your mind of those, and then we would shift to sheet A03. And then you can get a sense of, from that property line, where the building would sit. So it's really the southernmost portion of the building that's closest, I guess, to the boundary line.
Yes, and I believe that distance is 83 feet from the property line, which would make it about 113 from the adjacent single-family homes.
Okay. Do we have any other discussion, DRB, in regards to separation of structures?
No.
Okay.
I'm good.
Okay. Okay, then let's look at modulation of the building. And in that one, we probably, let's see here, look at what sheet probably makes the most sense. We look at it in two ways, in plan as well as vertical modulation. And so I think you can, simply stated, if you're looking at, I don't know, sheet A04, you get a sense of the plan modulation, but I think your perspective images here are probably just as telling. So the lower image there is, in essence, the side that faces the R1. It's got significant sort of entry porte-cochere and elements that extend towards the west on the north end of the structure. So again, we talked about this quite a bit last time with the balconies and the roof lines and some of the detailing up at the gables and the roof lines. So in my opinion, the building does a nice job at modulating something so large.
I totally agree. We talked about this quite a bit last time. I really like the design of the building.
I agree as well.
Any other comments? Brett, Marlene, Nels?
Yeah, I'm seeing it for the first time and it definitely looks modulated.
Yeah, I'm good with it, Darren. There's no issues I have.
Okay. Okay. I'll move on then to roof lines. Again, I think the roof lines, obviously with the gable forms and the pitch of these roofs, is very residential in its scale. I think that is one of the elements that, that we're trying to focus on some of these alternative to zone transition is, do you sort of resemble the mass and scale, of the adjacent zones? Now, nobody can argue that 94,000 square feet is anything like a house, but in regards to the forms and how the roof is treated, it is very residential like.
Agreed.
Other comments? Okay. Okay, any other comments from members?
A question for the architect. Did the building itself move to the east because of the drive moving to the east, that 10-foot construction, or did it remain where it's always been?
The building itself hasn't moved. We're getting pretty tight against the property line along the backside of the building. So it stayed the same. We took it out of the drive aisle, and what we actually ended up doing, we had some more parking in front of the building on the in this island in front of the porte cochere, and we had to relocate that as we tightened things up. So we added some parking down toward the end of the building to make up for that.
Okay, so the roof line elevation has not gone down any. It's still at the same height.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. All right, I'll move on with no other comments on roof lines. I'm going to move on to location of services. So, obviously what we're talking about here is really kind of, trash and loading and that kind of stuff. And so this is one that we want to maybe talk about a little more in depth because, obviously it's right out in front. Okay. So, talk to us a little bit about, obviously loading, that's maybe a little bit different. It's not like you have a structure that's there. It really kind of depends on what the loading activities are. I think if it's like commercial traffic and it's, a big noise impact, and that's where we want to look at not having that, closer to that zone transition than we'd like. And same with trash. A lot of times trash, it's unavoidable in a lot of developments. You need to get it in a position that is, is manageable, for pickup and, and such. And more often than not, we require them completely to be screened and out of sight. So they can be incorporated, I think, nicely, but then there's activity that happens. There's taking out the trash and there's noise associated with it. So currently my thought on the position of it is that, they're in a position on the site that may suggest maybe more noise adjacent to, the zone transition. And so I can talk about its location and what steps you're going to, you're attempting to do there to help mitigate that.
Sure. One of the big things that I want to point out with respect to the location of the loading and its proximity to the adjacent single-family zone is we are substantially lower from the single-family homes. So as part of our package, we put together some renderings from the perspective of the adjacent yards, and at the loading, we are 18 feet down from adjacent grade at the property line. So as a result, we did a 3-year and a 7-year growth study. The loading truck should not even be visible from the adjacent properties. Even after just the 3-year growth, at that point you might see the tips of the roof peaks, but it doesn't appear that you would even see the loading trucks from the adjacent parcels. And after 7 years with a little bit more growth, you'll be lucky to even see the building with a little peekaboo view maybe. So we feel like we've really made an effort in our change to add the additional 10-foot strip and to retain more planting and mitigate that well. That along with the natural grading, I feel like it's a pretty effective screening of the loading. We really the way this site works, we really don't have a lot of options. You know, the site is not wide enough to have circular drive all around the building. We had to get all of our parking and our loading on one side, but we have at least made sure that we feel it's significantly screened.
So I think from the buffer standpoint, ultimately, I think to me, it seems like, yeah, it would be screened. I guess what I may be, getting at is it's pretty much like a commercial property with this many residents. I don't know what your pickup schedule will be for like trash and or deliveries, but it almost seems like it could be daily, right? And I guess it's more the activity and the noise associated with that seems more commercial-like and would want to be, away from the R1 zone. That's all. That's where I'm going.
I can speak just a little bit to this because it's it gets into the operations of the building, which isn't my expertise, but I have designed enough senior housing to be somewhat familiar. The typical community like this will probably have most of the waste management companies will give you some flexibility to schedule. So you can do a weekly pickup. You can do a pickup every twice a week. And we have yet to do that analysis with a waste management company. But I would guess that this might be at most two pickups per week from a garbage perspective. As far as loading and deliveries, the big one is food services. We've got 82 units here. That's a lot of residents. That's a lot of food. So you will typically see, on average, probably one or two 30-foot box delivery trucks that will pull up there on any given day, for half hour to 45 minutes for food deliveries or other miscellaneous supplies, maybe some medical supplies. So this loading space, as far as commercial usage, it's probably going to get used on average twice a day.
Okay.
And these are pretty low level commercial uses. I mean, obviously, anytime you've got a delivery truck, there's noise involved. But this is not really intensive industrial loading like you might see in some other settings. This is commercial service for residential use.
Okay. How are you screening the garbage? It has an enclosure, I presume.
Yeah, it's kind of self-screening. There is a retaining wall because we've continued to have cross slope from the property line toward the building. So we've leveled out the grade for the drive aisle itself, obviously. And what that's doing is it's meaning that by the time you kind of wrap around the drive, you're several feet lower here. So this retaining wall here is kind of holding back the higher drive aisle, and we have not done a detailed analysis of that, but it's probably a couple feet below the adjacent drive aisle. We would certainly be putting a fence to make sure that the overall enclosure, once its final design is put together, is at least 6 feet. So a combination of the grading, retaining, and then we'll probably end up with a 36 or a 42-inch fence around there. Because the site was getting so tight, in particular, since we've had to shift this drive aisle, we are right up to the retaining for the trash enclosure in this short section, but we're able to get and retain elements of landscaping on either side of that. And I'd also point out that the loading location is directly opposite of this large area of landscaping here. So, we not only have that 20-foot buffer, the additional 10 feet, we've got another 20 feet on top of that of landscaping directly opposite of the loading.
Okay. So the one significant tree just about where your cursor is to the left there that you're going to leave in place, what can we expect for, again, I'm thinking about acoustics to some degree. And so the dense native buffer, I think, will help with that. And maybe even in the area that is just north of the last parking stall, maybe that from a landscaping standpoint becomes a little more of this dense vegetative buffer. But I'm maybe as much concerned about, what is left, when you have on one hand, we want to keep a significant tree. On the other hand, it's one tree. Is it helping us with, putting in some infill, in that area in order to help us create somewhat of a sound buffer?
I don't have a section exactly through that area, but we do have some site sections that can kind of illustrate what's going on. You can see, if you look at this line of 290, when the site is graded, the loading is at, I believe, 292. So it's almost at this 290 line. The adjacent properties are up about at the top of this retaining wall. So we've got an 18-foot differential, and when you're not able to visually see the loading, the same thing is kind of true of the acoustical properties. They're going to bounce off that wall. There's not going to be a direct acoustical line to the adjacent properties. The angle that grading is kind of blocking off the level of the loading is going to mean that any direct acoustical line is going to fly well over the adjacent single family homes. So when it comes to acoustics, I'm not an acoustical engineer, obviously, but that direct line of acoustical transmission is by far the most disruptive. There's only so much you can do, and I think to the extent that we are recreating a very healthy buffer, that will certainly mitigate the peripheral sound.
Okay, other comments from board members in regards to location of services?
No.
None for me either.
Okay. Okay, then maybe flipping back to one of your perspectives, I think we talked about window and balcony orientation. I think this really was a part of our discussions when we talked about modulation and roof line. I think if I recall correctly, I think the board was responded favorably to the windows and the balcony locations on the property, especially as the east or west facing elevation to the R1. Any other comments from board member?
That's what I recall.
Okay. All right, no other comments. We'll move on to lighting. Okay. Let's see, so I guess the the main lighting standards for the entire property for Gig Harbor, the Gig Harbor lighting standards would be in play for this. Everything is downward directional. I know we need a certain minimum, foot candles for security reasons. So I guess the question would be, we have a drive lane and parking. I think I can see your lights. Yeah, I can see the little icon right in your graphic. So maybe talk to us about the height on those, in essence, what sort of foot candles are we talking about producing with those? Again, because these are lights probably going to remain on all night, right? From a safety standpoint with cars, I don't know if they're going to turn off during the night, or they're going to just be on running 24, at least when it's dark, they'll be running all the time.
They typically would be on at night, 24 hour, well, not 24 hours, but at night. We don't have a specific fixture picked out for these, but they would likely be certainly downward directional diffuse and probably on 12-foot poles. That's pretty common for our standard parking lot lighting. So these would not be the large 20-foot commercial poles. They'd almost certainly be 12-foot fixtures.
Well, and I think what ends up happening, just as a point of reference, the we'd love to see shorter poles, right? But that requires generally more. And when budgets come into play, a lot of times those pole heights get up there so you can get those beam spreads a little wider. So I think in this case, my opinion is anything that would be on this side of the building would try to maintain that lower pole height. 12 foot is more like I don't know, a lot of times that's like city sidewalk kind of heights, and parking lot lights generally would be higher than that a lot of times. But again, not having maybe your electrical engineer or somebody else, to speak to this, I would like to see lower pole heights, for these lights all along this west side, so that in essence, you're pushing, the start of that light level as low as we can. Any other comments from board members?
No, I agree 100%, Darren. I think especially on this side, on the side that faces the residential houses, that keeping that height down just so that any intrusion of light that might trickle across through the buffer is limited. So yeah,
if I could chime in just quickly on lighting and the performance standards in the RB2 zone. The outdoor lighting is required to be shielded so the direct illumination remains confined to the property boundaries of the light source. And also ground mounted floodlighting or light projection above the horizontal plane is prohibited between midnight and sunrise. So those are additional standards. Those are standards additional to what's already required, the lighting requirements in the design manual.
So you're saying, Carl, we can't have anything that shines up after midnight.
Correct.
And everything is in essence sort of downward directional. You're shielded, so you don't have any, any glare balls that you're looking at. And okay, so and again, I agree that 100% of those standards should be met for sure. And again, I think when it comes to parking lot lighting, I think we might look to in assistance to help in this zone transitions to try to get these lighting poles down lower on this side. And obviously try to maybe minimize building lighting as well, because the building, if you illuminate the building, I mean, it looks nice and all of that, but then from the R1 zone, you're going to be, you're going to see in essence, this illuminated building, where in most cases, most residential, homes are not illuminated that way. They might have an entry porch light or something else, but they generally sort of become a little more dark, in the evening and sort of quiet down. So. What are you proposing, James? I might ask, what's proposed for any lighting, say, on the building itself? Moving up, the 2 or 3 stories that we can see from this side.
We don't have anything up high in the building. We have some fairly typical bollard path lighting, and again, that would be in accordance with the Gig Harbor Code. Which means it's almost certainly got to be downward directional. We have not specified the fixture yet, but we've got that along the sidewalk periodically just for safety reasons, to make sure that residents and anyone out there, can see where they're headed. We also have some wall sconces, which again, to comply with the Gig Harbor Code, would be downward directional, and we have those periodically along the elevations. So you can see, I believe that's light type C. These are primarily off of, these are small fixtures that are essentially porch lights for each of the resident balconies. Actually, I have to apologize and retract what I said, because you're right that these do extend for the porches on all 3 floors back here. We do have porch lights.
Yeah, so again, I think even with the porch lights, to be very specific, again, those lights are going to be moving up, the building facade higher and higher. It's all the more important that they're, they have no glare whatsoever. They're very downward directional. They either do the job, or you've got some recessed lighting, in the soffit above the porch or what have you, so that, we really can just focus on getting the light where it needs to be, and it's not sort of visual annoyance heading to the west. Okay.
Yeah, there should be no lighting here that's going to provide any direct glare anywhere off the property. It's all going to be downward directional.
Okay. Any other comments on lighting from board members?
Nope.
Me either.
Okay. All right, moving on to vegetative buffering. So I think we talked about this quite a bit. I think we reviewed this. So really, in essence, talking about that westerly side there. And is there any other discussion board members want to talk about relative to that?
Yeah, actually, I think I do want to talk about this a bit.
Okay.
And some of these things have already been mentioned, but I want to reiterate some of them. So Carl, I'm going to address this to you just to understand. In our code, when you have 2 zones like this up against each other, normally there would be a 40-foot buffer and then 10 foot. Can you explain what is this about the 10 feet extra?
Yeah, I certainly can. So the 10 feet is found in, James, if I could take back sharing really quick. I'm just going to pull up this code section I had ready to roll in case this conversation came up. So in 1778, which is our landscape standards, we have 1778-092, which is protection of significant trees and existing native vegetation. And this is where there's kind of a little bit of an overlap between our landscaping code section and the design manual. And it can get a little gray, can get a little fuzzy, but ultimately the idea here is that we protect any of these areas that are designated as landscape or buffer areas, or which are otherwise retained under the provisions of Chapter 1799, in this case, a zone transition buffer. They're subject to a 10-foot wide no construction zone. And I think as Mr. Brown said earlier, that is meant to protect the buffer area, whatever that buffer might be, as it's stated. It says clearing, grading, or contour alteration is not permitted within that no construction area, that's the 10 feet, unless a qualified arborist provides written documentation of proposed construction activity within that 10-foot setback will not harm existing vegetation within the designated landscape or buffer area. And so that's where the 10-foot no construction zone comes into play.
Okay. So it's the purpose of the 10 feet is that if you have landscape that you're retaining within the buffer, you're not harming that landscaping existing. But in fact, there isn't that much landscaping that's actually being kept. I can't tell from these plans what's an existing tree that's significant that's being retained. I guess I want to know if whether what they're doing meets the intent of having that 10 foot, right? So if the intent is I need to protect the vegetation that I'm keeping, they're regrading. So it doesn't really meet that intent, right? Because they're regrading it anyway. So they're going for an alternative of we're regrading and we're replanting, basically. I'd say, you have a problem that's beyond the scope of our discussion, that there was this agreement that was made prior that the 40-foot buffer was split between different lots, half of it being on a residential zone, that it doesn't seem to us or to me that that end of the bargain, let's say, was kept up. So now your 40 feet is really 20 feet. And you know, this, you know, you look at this and it's sort of a snowball, you know, right? You look at the site and you say, well, okay, there's a wetland on the site and then there's a wetland buffer. So there's this whole area I can't build on anyway, just from how you do these things. And then, you know, suddenly everything is snowballing to, oh, you know, we need this stormwater vault. We need fire access to the whole, we need to get the fire truck around the whole building. And, you know, if the intent of all these rules was you don't take a site and regrade the whole thing to make your building fit, unfortunately, as you keep going through the process and you find all these things that you had to do that you maybe didn't anticipate, what you're trying to do doesn't fit on the site without remaking the site, which is, you know, what's in your design review code set. You know, the intent of that is, you know, don't remake this, work with the site rather than trying to remake it. So, I mean, I guess what we're looking at tonight is the question of whether the landscaping that is being proposed is enough of a compensation for, you know, doing so much to the site that is working against what was there originally. So I'll just put that out there as the, you know, that's the question, I suppose. I mean, I guess that we are allowed to judge that it is that, am I understanding that correctly, that that's what we're looking for when we're looking at an alternative, is to say that the landscaping that is being provided here is enough of a compensation for all the changes that have been made to the site that are maybe not in the intent of what the rules and the design manual says.
The particular provision that we're reviewing now, or the design element that we're looking at currently, is a vegetative buffering. That is a design element of the alternative zone transition. And the question, each of these design elements have a question associated with them. And the question in this case is, does existing on-site vegetation provide screening opportunities or otherwise ensure the privacy of residents in opposing zones? And so in this case, it's talking about existing vegetative buffering and not necessarily what would be planted. And so I think the point and the intent of this is to get after how much impact is the proposal having on the zone transition buffer. How many trees are they removing? In other words, how much vegetation is being impacted, and what, and from that, all things being equal, you know, taking out the idea of additional landscaping to replace it, does it provide the necessary screening?
Sorry, so what was that number again? How many significant trees were being within, let's say, that zone that we're talking about? Do we have a number of how many significant trees there were?
Well, there's six proposed for removal. The majority of the trees that exist on the site at this point, the site was cleared a long time ago. And when it was, they left the buffers intact, as we would do anytime we allow development on a vacant site. And so the majority of the significant trees exist within the significant trees exist within this buffer. There are a few other significant trees elsewhere on the site, but not very many. And so I would, not knowing exactly, they've got 61 significant trees on site. They're retaining 54 of those significant trees. I would argue that 90% or more of those 61 trees are probably found in this buffer.
Oh, sorry, they are in this buffer or they aren't? I misheard you.
They are.
They
in this
are.
buffer. And correct me if I'm wrong, applicant, anybody from the applicant team.
I don't have the numbers, but your statement in general, I think, is correct.
But
Yes, that's correct.
But you're keeping 54 out of 61 of them?
Michelle,
Correct.
could you speak to that? I don't have the exact numbers.
And that's overall. So some of the trees being removed are for driveway access. So they're over by where the driveway enters the site. In the location of the buffer that we're discussing relative to the east or the west side of the building, there are 4 significant trees that are being removed. The other significant trees are in the location closest to the drive access.
Is there a plan somewhere where all of this is shown?
Yeah, and James, you showed that, the tree retention plan.
Yes, let me flip to that.
Michelle, one other thing we might ask in adding on to Marlene's discussion here is, can you also quantify the number of trees that are going to be removed due to disease, at least from an arborist report? Obviously, from the neighboring R1, and being respectful of their comments,
Right.
whether it's diseased or it's not diseased, just the fact that it's coming down, is the quantity the number that they're probably most interested in.
And I don't have that quantity for the overall, but as you can see right here in this cluster, there are 3 that have the triangle, which are diseased per the arborist's review. And as stated by Carl earlier, the encroachment into the 10-foot buffer was reviewed by the arborist. So all these trees were reviewed by a professional arborist, and their retention or removal was recommended per his report, which was provided to staff.
Mm-hmm.
So 3 trees are diseased and dying. 4 trees, as you can see with the circle with an X, are significant, required to be retained. Anything with a 0 on it, such as the one down below, is an insignificant tree, but is being retained or removed, depending on what where it's located within the grading. And then this tree with just an X by itself is outside of any buffer retention requirements.
Okay, thank you.
I have one more question. Were your dead, dying, diseased trees, are they part of your 61 count?
They are not, because per code, a tree that is dead, dying, and diseased is not considered a significant tree.
Yeah, that's good.
And in answer to that question, I count 7 shown on these plans that are dead, dying, or diseased. So 7 in addition to the 4, 11, and then there's a couple that are within the 10-foot no construction zone. So potentially 12 to 13 trees overall.
Thanks, Carl. I think that's in essence, that gets out on the tables, it's transparent about the number of trees coming down. There's some quantification, and some detail about why certain ones are coming down, but that's the number I think that, at least makes it a little more transparent in regards to the adjacent neighbors. Okay. Marlene, are you good with your discussion? Any other question or comment?
No.
Okay. Anybody else in regards to the vegetative buffering?
No.
Okay. Okay, existing non-conformities. I think there are none, right? Because the houses are all, they're all built right in the last 6 years. And entryway orientation. So obviously the entry to the sites on the north side and the south side connected. at least to the site, the entry to the building, obviously is on its west side, which faces the R1. The R1, I think the benefit here is that the R1, that's sort of the back portion of the R1. I think just by logistics, you know, and how the building is set up, they've, in essence, pushed the entry back, you know, off of the buffering area. It's recessed a bit, but again, I think it is what it is. I don't know of any other way to, you know, sort of develop a building where you wouldn't have your parking, especially in a senior care facility adjacent where the main entry is going to be. So I think they've done a good job in sort of mitigating that and pushing it away from that buffering area. Other comments? Okay. With no other comments will that leads into location of parking and driveway entrances, which I was saying the north and south side. So we've talked about this quite a bit. I think the you know, in a sort of a perfect scenario, we'd look to push all of the sort of activity with vehicular traffic, other things, we push it away from the R1 as much as we can. But here and then lies sort of the, you know, the discussion is that generally speaking, and maybe even very specifically, they will have the buffer that is required to not even worry about these alternative zone transition standards. So I think in each case, if we can still make a little bit of a suggestion to make sure we're doing the best we can, recommendations for each one of these, I think the property as a whole is superior in regards to not only meeting the buffer, but it's also meeting the alternative zone transition standards. So in this case, for parking, can't do much about, you know, cars and whatnot, but the fact that it's lower, you're not going to have any headlight, you know, sort of nuisance to the adjacent property. If we focus on the lighting associated with the parking area to be on lower poles, that also sort of minimizes its impact. So I think it's doing a great job in where it's located.
I'd like to add a point to this comment, if that's okay. When we first started exploring the site, you know, the building, you've got to, any project is going to have parking, and it's by, you know, it is a building. And really what we were faced with was having to make a decision on whether the building is up against the buffer and the property line, or the parking is. And we really felt strongly that it would be in the neighbor's interest if we pushed the building back, which also pushes it downhill, and left a lot more distance, and got the building kind of further off their property and away from them. So I know that generally we would try to get the parking away from the neighboring property line, but in this case, I feel putting it where it is actually a better design solution.
Thank you. Any other DRB member comments? Okay. Moving on to open space and common areas. Just for a review of that, James, can you just highlight those for us, you or Michelle? I think they look pretty obvious, but why don't you just highlight those for us?
What specifically are we looking for? Open space and common areas?
Yeah. I mean, in essence, the question is, do we use them to help, in one sense, sort of making a transition between a different zone? So obviously, if they're located, you know, open space, they're located, you know, between your development and, you know, the neighboring zone, that's a good thing. So I don't know if we're looking at the northwest corner of the property, which I think is good, where you push the driveway downhill a bit. And that's probably just, you know, a result of sort of grading, but it does create some open space to those R1 units that are on the north side. And you've got some there, it looks like, on the south side too.
That's correct. We do, for that length of the buffer, we do have large areas, and granted they are at the north and south end primarily, that we have been able to enhance the landscaping. and provide some additional screening. Certainly from any of the properties that are viewing the building from an angle, they'll provide additional screening. And we also have tried to, we do have a fair amount of landscaping between the parking and drive aisle and the building itself. So we're trying to kind of soften the transition that way as well.
Okay. Can I maybe ask a question about your parking? You know, obviously it's this linear single drive arrangement there. Could the northernmost stalls, could they move more northerly, and maybe some of the southernmost stalls move more southerly? And the reason I would ask this, and I don't know if it's logistically possible with your grading, is that we could still retain the same number of stalls that you need, but we might be able to develop a pocket of open space or more buffering at a specific strategic spot, maybe adjacent where the dumpsters are, where the entrance is, and maybe even the ability where you're taking out some of the existing trees, maybe they could remain if the retaining wall were to shift along that line a little bit to the east.
I can kind of explain or try and respond to your question. We know that we can't shift stalls further north because we're coming down significantly from the adjacent 72nd to get to our parking lot and pad level. So that's a relatively steep driveway there, and we can't push any further to the north or that driveway just becomes too steep and unmanageable. We have a similar challenge, although we may have slightly more flexibility, and I'd have to defer to Thayer on this. We have a similar challenge where, this is a long site. By the time you get down to where it meets up with Wagner Way, we're getting a slope that's going to exceed the what's allowable for cross slope for parking. So I can't say that we couldn't potentially tighten this up by 1 or 2 stall lengths. That may be possible, and Thayer would have to comment on that. But I can say that at most, I would say it may be possible that we could, for example, shift the stalls 1 or 2 stalls to the south and maybe get a slightly larger bulb of landscaping in front of the main main entrance to the building. But that's probably the extent of what we could do. And I don't even want to, I don't want to commit to that without Thayer's input.
Yeah, I guess what I'd be maybe suggesting is, go ahead, Thayer.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so James is absolutely right on the north end. That's such a tight situation to come down off of 72nd into the site and still get some maneuverability coming in and out of the entrance of the down in the entrance by the Perkshire. So from that end, it's very tight. And again, we're maintaining a maximum of 6-foot retaining walls along there too. So and just out of reference here too, one of the reasons that both grading and site distance requirements out of that driveway is where that driveway is set down on 72nd. So we're limited there. You could possibly push it down to the south a couple stalls. You can see from Wagner Way, it's pretty steep coming up through that first stretch. But yeah, right now it's at 10%. We could probably stretch that down to 2, 3, 4 stalls, but then we're at the maximum 15% coming up pretty steep on that driveway. So from a traffic standpoint, from a maneuverability, it's not ideal. Right now, we've got it pretty well balanced. This is a 3-dimensional puzzle here with this site. It's a very difficult site to try to fit everything in, and so possible, but I'm not sure what we gain in the overall picture.
I think that the most. the most that would allow us to do is to take a essentially an 8 or a 9 foot kind of intermediary landscape strip in the parking and potentially make it 2, possibly 3 stalls wide. But that's the absolute maximum of what I think that shifting the parking south could buy us.
Well, and I guess what I would ask sometimes, this is an alternative landscape plan, so that means, we can look at it and not necessarily meet the prescriptive standards. And one of those standards is parking, landscaping within the island, like how many stalls you can have, and then, have a landscape bed. I mean, you've got 3 of them that are there now, right on the south side, or on the west side of the parking. And just to suggest, and not that it's good that we're losing landscape pieces there, but I would be more apt to, especially in and around where the trash enclosure is, and and that's somewhat of a entry point. If that first 6 stalls of your northerly parking, that whole area, that retaining wall would slide south, and that grading come in there, and you bring in some more dense vegetative buffer. Maybe there's even an opportunity to leave a couple of those trees in that zone. To me, I think I would trade that for having those parking islands. I wouldn't even worry about the need of those, because you've got a retaining wall you're butting up against. I think they're nice, don't get me wrong, it'd be nice to have them, but if push comes to shove, I'd rather have more landscape area and buffer where you have the most activity on your site right there, and potentially where the buffer is a little weak by retaining the existing trees that are there. It'd be nice if we could not only retain those, but have another 20 foot of area where we could make it a little more dense in that zone. So that's why I was asking that.
I would not have any objection to doing something like that. My only concern would be that the requirements are pretty prescriptive in the code, and we're actually exceeding the requirements. I don't recall how many stalls offhand need to be between your landscaping, but we're down at 6 and 7 instead of up at 9 or 10 in most cases. So we are exceeding the code, and my concern would be that I would be happy to follow any suggestion that we all think would improve the project. But I'm concerned that if we've got to meet the prescriptive code, and I don't know what kind of recourse we'd have, or if the code would even allow us to consider, going to a spacing of 12 or 14 stalls without a landscape strip to separate them. I don't want to get in a situation where we're doing something that could trigger a whole other process or a variance or something like that. So I kind of like Carl to speak to whether or not that would even be possible.
Well, Carl, that just by the title on that drawing, is this in fact an alternative landscape plan?
Yeah, they are proposing an alternative landscape plan, primarily because of the, correct me if I'm forgetting now, James, but because of the encroachments into the 10-foot no construction zone.
Michelle,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
Thank you.
Michelle, that's correct. Are you saying yes, that's correct?
Yes,
Okay,
it's to
thank you.
mitigate encroaching into the protection zone.
Yeah, and so and you're correct, Darren, in that this 1778 does require the landscape islands between every 9 stalls, and so there could be some flexibility within the alternative landscape plan to allow for some deviation to that design. Mm-hmm. Of course, it would have to meet the criteria for an alternative landscape plan, which would require that it is, let's see, represents a superior result much like what we're looking for from a design alternative. It's sort of similar criteria there.
Right.
Incorporates increased retention of significant trees. Provides, and the other two don't apply in this case, but
I think it has, you know, just to jump ahead, I think it has the criteria, very much so. And I guess I would look to trade those 3 islands. And maybe if you're over in parking, you know, take a couple stalls, slide them to the south a bit, and look to create a buffer, you know, that's like, if you imagine that those parking stalls weren't there for, I don't know, the first 6 stalls or whatever, right? That could be all landscape. And in that zone, we could not only try to retain a few more trees, we could make exactly the way you're planting it now, a little more dense buffer there. And I think it is far superior to help mitigate, and if there's the potential to retain some of the existing trees there, because the retaining wall could go away or move south or move in essence east in order to, you know, retain some of that grade. I think that would be a superior solution.
I don't know that we could quite, it would quite extend far enough to retain the additional trees. Certainly it would provide some additional landscape buffering along the front of the building and in front of the loading.
Well, right, but what you're talking about there though too is maybe you retain the first 3 stalls or 4 stalls, but then you know, we look at pushing that a bit. I know it would be a geometric sort of jogging of the wall, but which may not be the most efficient. But if you're going to retain some trees, it seems like right there in the most active part of your property is where you want to do it. And I would be all for, you know, getting rid of some parking in that zone and really planting it up heavy. And my recommendation would be get rid of in essence, the landscape islands in that strip if you need to, in order to retain some stalls that you need. Because I think we can get a really significant landscape buffer in that zone, which is going to be most helpful. Exactly. Right. And
we could certainly explore that. I imagine that Thayer, the civil engineer, would have to really crank some numbers and analyze the grading. You know, certainly if we had some relief on the spacing for the intermediate stalls, or not stalls, intermediate landscape strips, that would help. We could see if we could get, you know, shift these down 1 or 2 stalls further to the south. So I don't have any objection to you know, following that direction if it's physically possible to do. And for that, I really need Thayer to assess it a little bit closer, because even though that may really help provide some additional buffering and landscape at that core area, I'm not 100% convinced that it will peel the grading back enough to get it out of the drip line and preserve those trees. But certainly it would have some meaningful impact regardless.
how tall is your retaining wall currently designed? Is it designed to meet prescriptively at 6 foot?
Yes.
Well, I would say if it helps with your grading, could we make it taller?
That would be a possibility.
I mean, I don't think it's a visual impact to, you know, the adjacent zone that the wall's taller, because they can't see it. But if it allows us to retain some of the existing grade and subsequently some of the trees, then, you know, we're already finding ways to mitigate, you know, a little taller wall here and there. I think there's a greater benefit to it. So I think there's some justification for allowing, you know, if the wall needed to jump to 7 or 8 feet. I'm not talking about, you know, crazy numbers, but again, just to, you know, see. And it looks like you're going from 306 down, you know, some cases down to, you know, what, 298. So it's about 8 foot of grade drop there. If you raised it up, you know, a couple feet, you know, at least you could cut cut that down a bit, get it to maybe 6. You could maybe spread that grade out a little bit more. Again, I don't know if it's a big help or not, but maybe if you had more horizontal room to run that wall out, you could get that grade up a little bit higher, maybe mount it in the area where you've got your trees that you're trying to retain.
I'm drawing some line work here that hopefully you can see, but this is approximating the impact of if we were to retain a rectangle like I'm showing, the grading lines would pull back to approximately this point that I'm sketching out. What I can't answer is whether or not that would be sufficient to retain the tree cluster right in there. I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay.
But your topographical cut lines would essentially move around it like that.
Okay. Well, again, I think there's potential there, and I think if you're already submitting an alternative landscape plan, so I think I think we have the latitude to be able to come up with something else other than the parking islands that you have, if we could find a greater use of where that landscape is. Okay, any other comments on, I guess we were looking at open space, common areas is where we were kind of talking, and then we kind of gathered up a bunch of them and threw them at that one. But and it's also existing natural characteristics of the site. So again, I think that's item L, which is the second to the last one within these alternative standards. Again, I think this buffer is really the key to it, and anywhere we can enhance it or make it stronger. And again, it's being a good steward. The R1 property, in one sense, didn't, as a subdivision, didn't do, what it needed to do in regards to establish that 20-foot on their end. But that doesn't mean we can't, at least I think you're doing a good job, with the development. I'm not trying to be hypercritical here, but I think there's a couple areas where I think we could do a little bit better. It requires a little bit of finagling, but it's a significant development. It's significantly different in size. And I think it's worthwhile to explore that. If there aren't any other comments on existing natural characteristics of the site, what about?
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Marlene.
What percentage of this site is wetlands that you're actually not touching at all? And wetland buffers?
I don't have an exact percentage. Thayer, do you have any information on that?
No, I don't have the exact numbers, but I would say it's pretty insignificant. Compared to the whole site. So you might be talking 5% or something like that.
And 5% is wetland and wetland buffer?
Yeah, I'm just kind of, something probably 5-7% or whatnot.
Well, okay.
But most of the wetlands are actually off-site. There's just an area kind of where this property line bows out that overlaps with a wetland. But they're really kind of almost hugging the property line. So we just have a little bit of this low point.
So sorry, how far is your property line from the street? I'm having trouble understanding your drawing. Can you show me the property line on Wagner Way? Oh wait, no, I see it. Okay, that's that one. Okay.
Yeah.
Is the driveway that you're putting in basically in line with the trail that's there now?
I don't know. I mean, it's approximately, but I don't have anything in a survey to tell you exactly where that trail is.
Okay, I'm sorry. That's off topic. Sorry. What was our area? What was our question here?
You were asking about how much of the site was wetland, and just eyeballing it, I think there might have been a little bit low. It's probably closer to 10% maybe. If you're including the wetland buffers.
Sorry. If you would, do you have a percentage of basically for the whole site, how much is disturbed versus undisturbed? And I guess that's not really the question. We're always looking at sort of a good balance, but I don't know. I'm just curious about that. How much of this, if you looked at your like lines of clearing versus entire site, how much is just being retained as it is?
It's a very tricky question because there's also a long dog leg to the site. So, and Thayer, do you have any specific statistic or data on that? Just eyeballing it, I would say there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of the site is staying undisturbed, but that's just a guess from visually eyeballing it.
Yeah, I think you're all right. We have those numbers. I don't have them in front of me on this one. But I will say we're way under, quite a bit under the allowed
Impervious.
developed area.
What were your numbers on impervious?
You're gonna have to give me a minute.
Sorry.
I've got the plans if it's noted on there.
Wouldn't be noted on those plans, but let me pull up the other ones. It's gonna take me a minute here.
And then what we were looking at before was your numbers for how much cut and fill, was that right? Yeah.
We submitted that last time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was one of the topics of the last meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't I would guess that pulling the drive aisle back off the property line actually gets that even closer to being balanced than it was when we previously discussed.
Yeah.
We don't have the updated numbers, but they'll actually improve.
So this project is it's under the concomitant agreement for zoning agreement to bring this into city. So I think the normal RB2 zone is 50% impervious developed, but in the concomitant agreement allows you to go up to 60. We're at 38 on the site.
Good. So Marlene, are you in essence, is your line of questioning really trying to kind of get a sense of like how disruptive are they to the overall property?
Yeah, that is yes, exactly.
Okay.
And there is I was just perusing this on Google View. I mean, I've walked by it a million times, but the part that's facing Wagner Way looks like it's going to be really, you're barely going to know the buildings there. Unfortunately, and I, just sort of thinking about that decision of putting the building, all the things that stem from where you decided to put the building, and does that make sense? And that's, you're pretty far in that process. And what you were saying about putting the parking up against that buffer, and the other things that you're saying, and I think that what you included in the package of those perspectives showing the plants, and maybe would have been helpful to see, or what we should look at more, your site sections, because there is a really good drop there, which is this is kind of going back to the previous topic of the buffering, because you have that pretty good drop there that's sort of further, and you know, you do kind of wonder about noise and, you know, whatever. You're going to have a commercial kitchen, which is going to mean deliveries and trucks backing up, and, you know, how much is that, you know, how does that make a transition? You know, again, the city doesn't want to see the same issues they have with all the houses that are up against the Costco loading zone. But I think looking at this, I'm convinced that you're not making that kind of situation for the people who live there. And I'm sorry, I'm backtracking on what we talked about previously, because we've already moved on past that, right? We're talking about, oh, I'm sorry, I forget what the original criteria was we were looking at.
Let me get you back on track.
Thank you.
So it was item L was existing natural characteristics of the site, which I thought you were sort of speaking to. So
yeah, I'm sorry to have drifted back to, you know, because I'm still kind of thinking about it, but yeah, to get back to the natural characteristics. I mean, I think we all have to admit that there's a big section of this where natural characteristics have really not been retained. But then you can say, well, there's the whole other part of the site where they have been.
So are you comfortable?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm moving on to citing materials and details. So the last of the 13 of the criteria. Okay. So this, maybe we look at one of your, you know, perspectives, you know, specifically maybe, you know, facing the R1 on the west side. And again, I think these were things we talked about at pretty lengthy in our last conversations. And so again, I think you're using materials that are very residential in their characteristics. So, and you know, the modulation, the windows, the balconies, it's, I mean, it's a, you know, it is residential in sort of the way it's treated. Again, nobody can argue that the mass is anything that's like a single family home, but you know, the elements that are there are certainly you know, found in the other residential developments. So I don't have any concern at all with the materials that are being proposed. Anybody have any other comments?
I thought they were approved last time.
I think we were looking at it from a design standard, but now that we're specifically looking at the alternatives, is basically in regards to just zone transition.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, any other comments? I know we're going on past 7, and typically we make a motion to extend, you know, past 7. I think we're really close to sort of, you know, getting this, you know, getting the issue sort of talked about. I don't know if we've come to any ultimate resolution yet, but I'd like to make a motion that we carry on here for at least 15 more minutes and try to bring this to a conclusion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
And second, and all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, we're moving on. Moving on. Okay, I'm gonna leave the alternative zones transition item, the first item, for a second, just so we can, I think, attack the second one, which I think is a little more consistent with the decision we made in the first round. So maintaining natural topography, and that is really looking at that extension of that retaining wall heading south to mitigate the driveway being moved further to the east, and then still maintaining some access around the vault. So the question I have for the applicant is, we mitigated the taller wall by use of vegetation planted on the lower base of that. Can we, it looked like on your landscape plan you were proposing the same. So is that correct? And maybe you can show us that in site plan.
Yes, one second. That is correct. Let me start sharing the screen again here. We did do a perspective of that. Now I will have to work with there to see with these trees. I believe are actually probably going to have to be closer to the wall, because the whole purpose of this higher wall is to allow us to get maintenance access around the vault. So this rendering, I apologize, is a little misleading. These trees are pushed back probably 8 or 10 feet from where they're showing. Let me pull up the landscape plan for you. Oh, no, we got the trees right.
So, well, that's the question I had was, are you going to gain access to the vault by driving over the vault? And can we have the trees planted up against the wall?
Thayer, could you possibly speak to that? Because I'm not as familiar with the vault maintenance requirements and standards there.
Yeah. The design is, if you look at the vault, you got access ports all over the vault that we got to have, and we have to have access to that. So yeah, the vault itself is designed to be able to drive maintenance trucks to get access to all areas of the vault. So that's all got to be level across there.
Okay.
And then just a quick additional information. The reason why the wall itself is dimensionally set back from the vault is there, in the public works standards and the stormwater manual, we got to maintain the same distance from any structures, which would include walls, the retaining walls, from the edge of the vault based upon the depth of the vault.
Right.
So that's why that wall is sitting where it's at.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. DRB members, do you have any comments on this? I think the wall is proposed to be what, 8.5 feet tall, and I think some of the other ones, as it moves more northerly, it's actually taller than that, and we already kind of made a decision on that, on how to mitigate that visually. Plus, it's it's way off Wagner Way behind the buffer or the wetlands. So, any other thoughts?
Right. No, I'm good with the walls.
Okay. All right. With no other, I'm going to propose that we make a motion on item 2 here to start. Everybody good with that? Okay, I'm going to make a motion here that the board finds that the extension of the retaining wall south to mitigate the driveway being moved to the east, thus resulting in an 8.5 foot high portion of the wall, is acceptable and considered equivalent by means of using additional landscape vegetation planted along the base of the wall to mitigate the visual impact of the wall as it exceeds the maximum height of 6 foot prescriptively. How's that sound?
Second.
It's been seconded. Okay, any other discussion? Okay, we'll call for the question. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, is that anybody have a nay? We all unanimous? Okay, so item 2 is approved. So going back to item 1, I think I'm going to put this out there. I would like to propose that there are a couple of items within the criteria that I would like to see the applicant actually work on and come back to the DRB on. And I'm going to run down a list. I'm going to make a proposal, a motion that the applicant work on these. So my motion is that the separation of structures I find to be adequate, equivalent solution. Item B, architectural modulation, I find to be equivalent solution. The roof lines, I think we're good. I would like to, on item D, have the applicant take a look at the location of the services, provide more detail associated with the enclosure structure, grading and landscaping in and around the loading dock, as well as the dumpster enclosure. Then on moving on to window and balcony orientation, I'm comfortable with that. With lighting, I would like to look at the applicant to come back and have a little more design direction in regards to lighting with the parking that is adjacent to the buffer, and maybe more specifically what specific lighting on this west side of the building itself relative to the individual tenant spaces or units, so that we have a good indication of how the building is going to be calm, not sort of, generally illuminated. I know they got windows and all of that, so that's something you really can't control, but it's just those porch lights and things that people might leave on all night. So I'd like to see a little more detail there. And then in regards to vegetative buffering, item G, I'd like to look at in the area where we talked about the parking adjacent to the buffer, if there's a way to reorganize the parking in a way to consolidate some additional landscape space, specifically as it relates to retention of some of the existing trees and preserving some of the grading, as well as maybe creating a more densely planted new buffer that might help mitigate some of the service areas located on the west side of the building. So I'd like to look at that. And then in regards to H, I don't think there's any concern with existing non-conformities. I, entryway orientation, I don't think there's any concern there. The location of parking and driveway entrances, again, I think the only item here on J would be just that what I mentioned in regards to trying to create more landscaping and buffering within a specific spot, as the parking might be able to be amenable to that, move it around a little bit. Item K is open space and common areas. I think you're doing really well, with the exception of when we might be able to get a little more buffering in that zone. And then item L, existing natural characteristics of the site. Again, I think the only item here, I think Marlene had talked about a few of those items here, but I think if we can retain some of the existing trees and grading around those areas along that sensitive part of the buffer, I think that would be worthwhile. And then no items in regards to citing materials. So I've kind of given you a little bit of homework on a couple of items, but they really are specific to a particular hotspot within the site. So that's my motion.
I'll second it.
I'm sorry it's so lengthy. It's been seconded by Tommy. Any other board member comments?
Just to get back to F, lighting, I think we've
Yes.
seen from some of our other applicants actual lighting plans of parking lots that show what, how many lumens are kind of falling on each spot. I don't know if the city requires that or if we're allowed to ask for that. I do know that in some other places in the city, we've had parking lots that are incredible amounts of reflected light off the surface. And Carl, you might be familiar with some of these complaints. And I guess that since we've seen that's already happened, I'm wondering if we have some way to make sure it doesn't happen again.
We generally sort of on a case-by-case basis require photometric plans depending. And typically that's where, we have a significant critical area involved on the site and or the potential to create nuisance within the right of way or on neighboring properties. And I would say that likely we would ask for something like that on this project. Once the applicant sort of honed in on the lighting plan, that's been something that they've been sort of waiting for the rest of this design to get more concrete, I think. And I'm sorry, James, if I'm putting any words in your mouth, but I think that's kind of where it's at. Once we got down the road, they're going to come back and sort of look at that holistically.
Yeah, we really needed some of these decisions to be made so that we had to get past the point where we're still moving drive aisles and parking stalls and shifting stuff before we really wanted to take any steps like that.
Well, I think for us, if we can, get a sense, it relates to lighting, like if there's a solution, not even knowing exactly the foot candles, but know, hey, we're going to keep it to 12-foot poles, and this would be kind of its spacing. I think that would be the best we could ask for. right? And as opposed to say 20 or 30-foot poles where they're, you know, extending way up, you know, maybe above the sight lines for the R1 properties above. So again, I think at this point, you know, there's other elements where we could get a little more specific, but I think there could be some general design review so that we could look at that and just make sure we're on the right path.
So are we asking them to come back with a more concrete lighting specs? Or are we asking, are we expecting that the city's going to be reviewing the photometrics?
I'm not asking for photometrics at this point. You know, I think there's, it's really more just the general lighting design to make sure that we're, you know, the types of lights we're talking about are probably not going to be a nuisance, you know, that, you know, we're not, you know, we wouldn't expect they're going to have a bunch of 5,000 Kelvin, you know, lamps that are open, you know, glare balls, you know, all strewn about the building. But I just like to know that, hey, we really looked at it. We're more sensitive on the west side of the building because of the zone transition. That's all.
Okay. So are we asking the applicant to come back with a more concrete plan of locations and specifications?
I would like to see, as maybe for the parking, like to see maybe a layout, what a 12-foot pole height, what does that suggest in regards to layout horizontally, how many, and then, you know, what sort of type fixture would you be considering? And the same with, you know, how are the balconies illuminated on the, you know, on the building? I know there's windows, I get that, you know, everyone have a window where they have shades or curtains. So the building is gonna, you know, if everyone has their lights on, that's gonna be more light than anything. So, you know, that's hard to mitigate that. Okay, any other comments on my motion discussion?
Sorry, for the service areas, were you also looking for them to come back with what the specifics of what the fencing is going to look like, or what the what are we asking for there?
I am asking for a little more specific on the enclosure and some of the grading around that. You know, specific landscapings, because I think that within the development, I don't know if they have an option to locate the loading and also the trash on the opposite side of the building away from the zone that we're trying to be sensitive to. So yeah, I'd like to see a little more detail there. But I think there's, you know, relative to that area, you know, and some of the buffering, I think there's only like really like between lighting 3 or 4 items here we're really talking about of the 13, really. Okay, any more discussion?
Could I ask a point of clarification?
Yes.
Where we're talking about that corner up by the dumpsters and reworking some of the parking there in the retaining wall, you had mentioned that you know, one thing to look at is to exceed this 6-foot height.
Yes.
If you take a look at the grading contours behind the wall, they're set up at 2-to-1 slopes right now. So for every, and those are 2-foot contours there. So for every step, so for example, if you take the contour 306 and would move it to where 304 is.
Yeah, I get where you're going. You know, it's like you can't make hay too fast because you'd have to go up to 12 feet, you know, in height or something, right?
Yeah. So is there a limit there? I mean,
I think in part there is, my suggestion would be, no, you know, I don't know if it's reasonable to say we'd have a 12-foot wall there, but, you know, parking up against it. I've seen, you know, other instances where we maybe needed to, but if the benefit is such that we could, you know, either push the wall out horizontally closer to the building, you know, as the red area is indicated in that little sketch, then we might be able to, you know, keep that grade up a little bit before it starts to descend down. And maybe we also find a balance to say, I don't want to put a limit on your design parameters. I think the goal would be, can we get more buffering? Is there potential to save some of the existing trees that are there that are worthy of saving? I would be personally all right with the wall climbing in height. I don't, know if there's an upper threshold to that. Maybe it's only in a certain area that we need to do that. And maybe we say, hey, and where it's really high, we get some plantings on top that grow over the top and try to help kind of soften it a bit. But there's some greater good that could be obtained by having a taller wall there.
Yeah, and I did look at that. We did look at that as an alternative, but to save that little batch of trees that Michelle had showed, you would have to have that wall in that area, climb them up to close to 10 feet or 12 feet or something to really save those trees with the root disturbance.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Which is possible. I mean, that we looked at that, but again, then we put, we're way above those 6-foot walls there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, my motion allows me a little latitude here because I think the justification would be that we find that there's some greater benefit by allowing it.
Okay.
I don't know if other board members want to chime in with their viewpoint, but that's my take on it.
This is a little, maybe something that should have been brought up earlier, or who knows, maybe it was. Is it possible to put your trash and your loading on the other side of the building?
No, it really wouldn't be practical because that means everything, that's going to the kitchen and the common areas, anything that's being delivered to the building would have to be, rolled 300 feet up a hill to get to the kitchen entry, and it would be pretty problematic.
So that's the where your fire truck ends is that dead end on the other side of the back, and you don't really have any vehicular access going further there. That's what.
Well, no, we can't. That's a fire lane has to stay.
But the fire lane kind of stops there, right in the middle of the building. There's no more vehicular there.
Yeah, the site narrows down pretty significantly. Just in front of that, we couldn't extend it any further, or we'd be grading off property.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that we're grading pretty close to the property line there.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'm going to ask it one last time. Any other comments regarding the motion that has been seconded to have the applicant go back and take a look at a couple of items in the alternative zone transition standards?
I'm making you work so hard, and I'm sorry. I guess I want to review exactly and just make sure we're very clear about what we're actually sending them back to review. So,
okay,
go for it.
So I'll only denote the ones that I'd like them to take a look at. So location of services. So specifically on what you're doing there, if you're not going to relocate them somewhere relative to the enclosures for the load, for the dumpster area and loading and landscaping around that. Lighting, we talked about lighting on the building as well as the parking area on the west side of the building. Vegetative buffering, specifically just in the area that is within the buffer currently that is adjacent to the R1 relative to where the entrance to the building is, where the services are, where the porte cochere is. Can we get, in essence, more buffering in that zone? And the other is, I wouldn't even worry necessarily about location of parking and driveway entrances per se. It really is it'll be a result of, we're not actually asking them to move them to another part of the site. We're just looking for some adjustments in order to maybe achieve something else of one of the other items. The open space and common areas, I don't think is really an item that we're really specifically looking at. We're really more focused on the buffer. And I think item L, again, is the existing natural characteristics of the site, if they can achieve more buffer in that area, that is satisfying that. So I don't think we're asking them to specifically look at that. So in my opinion, it's item G, the buffering, item F, the lighting, and item D, the location of services. Those 3 items. To not make it sort of meander on, right? If we can hit those specifically as I described them, then I think we're in my opinion would be able to satisfy all of these zone transition standards. Okay, does that answer your clarify it for you, Marlene? I see the head shaking. Okay, this is in essence, we're approving item 2. So the wall, the 8 foot 6 inch high wall is done. So we're just sending the applicant back to work on 3 of the items in item 1 relative to the zone transition standard. So call for the question. All in favor? Aye.
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 So Marlene and Brett.
Oh, sorry.
Aye.
Okay, so we're in unanimous. Okay. So I know that was a marathon session. I appreciate everyone's patience and comments, both from the applicant, the city, as well as our public comment. I think is very helpful. Hopefully, it's not too much trouble to consider looking at these things. I think it will help. I think the project's already done a great deal to at least their fair share, of what is required of the buffer. I think this would, if you could achieve this, what we're talking about, I think you'd be going over and above. And I think it would be a great benefit to the project and the neighboring community as well. Brett, you want to take over?
Or Chair, if I
Doing
could.
so well, though. You can wrap it up.
Oh, am I muted? No. If I could just interject for just a second here, just quickly. So there's a possibility that some of these changes that they are going to come back to you with might include a taller wall section on that western buffer.
Mm-hmm.
And we are already, you've made a motion now to approve the taller wall on the eastern side. I guess where I'm going with that is that it might make sense to kind of capture all of those taller walls in one alternative.
We could, Carl, but I think this one specifically may have a different solution, because I don't think they'll be able to plant a vegetative buffering on the base. And so I'd like the DRB to have a look at it and maybe make some recommendations. If the wall's tall and they don't have any issue with it, with cars parking up against it, or if they would like to see some mitigation with planting that can climb over the top of the wall, so to speak, and cascade down to soften it a bit, or what the wall is made of, I'd like to still have that discussion.
Okay, so if they come back, then if the applicant comes back with plans that show a wall that's non-conforming on that side relative to these changes, then what we'll be bringing back to you then a new alternative to 1799 240 for a taller wall. So that just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page with that.
Yeah, I think the precedent's already, from the board on this particular project is I'm sure we'll find a solution that's amenable to the board.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any other questions from the applicant of us before you set off back to the drawing board a little bit?
No questions for the board. I do, Carl, I will have questions for you. I want to make sure that I better understand the parameters under which we can, propose some alternatives within the confines of the alternative landscape plan. So I'd certainly like to talk more with you about that, Carl. so that I'm confident that we understand, what kind of flexibility we do and don't have in trying to provide this additional mitigating buffer around the front of the building. But I do thank the board for listening and giving some good input and guidance, and looking forward to working with Carl and the rest of the design team and addressing your comments.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're free to go, and the board will conclude its business for the night, since I'm gonna take this all the way home here. Carl, are you aware of the upcoming meeting? I guess it would, we're talking about the Pioneer development, right? The mixed use development on May 13th.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, Michelle, do you have the DRB schedule in front of you by chance, so that we can talk about when we're able to even continue this meeting? We have to look at when we can get this back here too.
May 13th, we have Burnham Apartments and Pioneer Mixed Use, and May 27th is available, and There On Out is available.
So there are 2 items on the 13th.
Yes.
Okay. So what were the 2 items again on May 13th?
Burnham Drive Apartments and Pioneer Mixed Use.
Okay. So likely that we'd be bringing this back on May 27th, I think, but we'll discuss that internally.
Okay.
But the next meeting is going to be, sounds like it might be a long one.
Okay. And this wasn't?
That's what I was gonna say.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Carl. Okay, any other comments from board members for the good of the order?
I'm sorry. I'm afraid in the future I might have to ask the city to provide me with hard copies again. I was spending a lot of this evening going back to the documents on the city's website and scrolling around, and I'm sorry, you probably saw me doing this a lot, trying to figure out what I was looking at and where in the many, and I'm not sure it would be that much better if I had hard copies to flip through, but I'd say I had kind of a hard time. And then kind of scrolling back to what the applicants were presenting versus, trying to see what would have been in the package, and even going through our 13 items and trying to understand what exactly they were looking for. So I appreciate all the talking and work you did tonight, Taryn. And I'm sorry.
And Marlene, you can make a request every week that we get these to go ahead and have them printed.
Yeah, I'm afraid I am going to have to ask for that. Could I ask a question about this? Did this project come in for a pre-design meeting with the city that the city sometimes does?
It did.
It did, eh?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Because it does seem like a lot of what we're dealing with is like a reaction to things that I don't know, that the designers didn't realize were coming, or were going, like the stuff about the fire lanes and I almost think from the other end of the counter that it's almost like there was information that maybe if I had at the start would have gone in a different direction. And I guess, I think the applicant, and I'm sorry, we've already made a motion and it's done, but the applicant is doing, an admirable job. But I just keep, there's a part of me that keeps saying they are trying to put too much stuff on this site. And maybe if they had known this when they started right at the beginning on the design and the performa.
Marlene, you bring up a good point that I think, I know we probably talked, about that for hours on end. And I think we face this with a lot of commercial projects, where performers, sort of drive, the viability of the project. But I'd like to have that conversation, as a separate thing when we have a light agenda or the board
Yeah.
can maybe just chat about it a
Sorry.
little bit. No, it's too lengthy, I think, to handle in a few.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. It's just, that I feel like I am a little bit frustrated. I think that, maybe our citizens that called in are a little frustrated. And I would think if I was the applicant, I would be a little friendly. Even if I was staff, I might be a little frustrated. So, I guess I would like to say, how do we do, is there a way, and again, you can't turn back the clock, but what can we learn from these experiences that might make other ones less painful?
Marlene, I believe that Katrina has set aside some time in the future for working sessions for us. I think that would be a great topic to email her for us to address.
Okay. All right. Any other comments from the board members before we call it quits?
May I make a motion that we quit now? Please.
Second.
It's been seconded. Okay, so all in favor of meeting adjourned, say aye.
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 All right.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for your patience and due diligence staying online for this. What is that, 2 hours and 45 minutes? So, wow.
Hey, thank you, Darren.
Hey, you guys. Until next time, thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, all.